What is homosociality, and is that a term that's specific to your book, or is it a broader thing?
It is not. Homosociality, in essence, really just means a same-sex relationship of any kind that typically is understood by sociologists to be social in nature rather than intimately sexual. And you find this term used really pioneered as a term in study of literature by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who uses it in regard to English literature to describe male bonding in that literature, a male bonding that is distinct from a homosexual kind of relationship. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the way I'm using it is based first on something that actually does happen, is pretty clear to everyone, which is that male characters bond in these certain social kinds of circumstances. Hospitality is a big place and way that male characters are bonding, in feasting, in harvest celebrations, and what men do with one another in those kinds of contexts. But in my book, I really speak specifically to homosociality as a male bonding that comes out of shared sexual experience. So while the male characters may not be having sex with each other, their sexual relationships or their sexual experience with female characters becomes a venue for them to bond, to share experience, to become friends, to become allies, to become partners. And so the sex with these female characters is cementing this homosocial bond. And that is the piece that I was exploring really throughout this book.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Barbara Tita. I realize that I, in the introduction, will say, and we'll be talking about, but I go over that at the upfront part of the interview. So I'm not going to bother with that right now. There is a lot in this episode about male relationships and how women factor into them in the Hebrew Bible and what masculinity is in Hebrew Bible. And it all culminates with Israel's God. For the free audience, I'm splitting this into two parts because in our correspondence, Barbara had said she prefers shorter episodes, and so I figured, out of deference to the guest, I will go ahead and just split it. So you're hearing it in two different chunks. I would love feedback on that. How do you like that? Would you prefer just an hour and a half long episode? Or do you like shorter episodes? Should I continue to do that where I can? As always, if you have any feedback, hit me up at itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. All one word, itmeanswhatitmeans@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Barbara Tita. Barbara Tita, welcome to the podcast.
I'm very happy to be here.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I teach biblical studies, biblical literature at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I also happen to be an ordained rabbi and have served Jewish communities in different settings and in different ways for the last 20 years. I very much like, in my time off, to read science fiction and fantasy.
And just as a heads up, we'll get into that with my last question. So I hope you have in the back of your head some recommendations. But before we get there, let's actually get into your book, Male Friendship, Homosociality, and Women in the Hebrew Bible, Malignant Fraternities. So just for the listeners, I had actually reached out to Barbara about an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature. And in our back and forth, I think we were going to actually set up the conversation, but she was like, hey, I have these books. Would you like to talk about one of those? And I'm always going to go for the longer thing to have a conversation about. So that's how we ended up on this. And then I see the title and I'm like, wow, okay, that is right up my alley for what this podcast is. And then I read it and I still think that. But so just starting off, what is homosociality, and is that a term that's specific to your book, or is it a broader thing?
It is not. Homosociality, in essence, really just means a same sex relationship of any kind that typically is understood by sociologists to be social in nature rather than intimately sexual. And you find this term used really pioneered as a term in study of literature by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, who uses it in regard to English literature to describe male bonding. In that literature, a male bonding that is distinct from a homosexual kind of relationship. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the way I'm using it is based first on something that actually does happen, is pretty clear to everyone, which is that male characters bond in these certain social kinds of circumstances. Hospitality is a big place and way that male characters are bonding, in feasting, in harvest celebrations, and what men do with one another in those kinds of contexts. But in my book, I really speak specifically to homosociality as a male bonding that comes out of shared sexual experience. So while the male characters may not be having sex with each other, their sexual relationships or their sexual experience with female characters becomes a venue for them to bond, to share experience, to become friends, to become allies, to become partners. And so the sex with these female characters is cementing this homosocial bond. And that is the piece that I was exploring really throughout this book.
And so the characters, just kind of roughly what I, off the top of my head, I didn't put a list in my notes or anything. So Judah, just as the male characters go, Judah, Saul, David, Jonathan, Abraham. How did you land on these characters? And I'm assuming there were many more throughout the Hebrew Bible you could have used.
Correct. Well, I have to be fair to say that how this whole thing started. So I'm going to take a step back to 2018, because in the fall of 2018, Christine Blasey Ford came forward to accuse Brett Kavanaugh, who was then being considered as a Supreme Court nominee, of sexual assault. And the thing about her story that really struck me at the time is that it wasn't just about Brett Kavanaugh, it was also about Mark Judge. It was about how two men effectively colluded, enabled each other, collaborated, and cooperated in creating a scenario in which she could be harassed and sexually assaulted. And at the time, it was just mind-boggling how I was walking through the hallways and would meet a female colleague, and we would end up like having this little box that we would tick about the various elements of her story that we ourselves had experienced or knew somebody who had experienced. And the thing that kept coming up over and over again was not that there was a single bad male actor, right? A single rapist, but the networks, the collusion, the alliances among male groups that enabled so much harassment, so much bystanding, so much collusion, so much witnessing, and so much shared activity. And that conversation going on in the hallway and going on with female friends of mine really hit a turning point when I said to one of those friends, why should I be surprised? I teach this stuff. And she said, what do you mean you teach this stuff? I said, oh yeah, Judah and Hero, right? And she didn't really know what I was talking about. And in that moment, I realized, oh my goodness, all of these relationships that I've been teaching about, that I'm telling her about. And she looked at me and she said, Barbara, you need to write a book. And that was the genesis of the book idea. And then the question was, which of the relationships made most sense to explore of the many male-male relationships that had come up as part of the exploration of classwork I was doing with my students. So the Judah Hira thing was really just having taught Genesis 38 so often and having been curious about the way in which people missed how important that relationship was. And then I also was looking for where were people described as friends, as king's counselors, right? Yonadab being one of them. That then became like, where did you see the word friendship operating so that you already knew you were starting with a male-male bonded relationship? Obviously, the question of David, Jonathan, and Saul, right, then emerged. You have almost triangulations of male-male bonding and relationships in that narrative. And then increasingly, as I was writing the book, I thought, well, to what extent are there bromances of a sort going on between the deity and his men? And that led me to Genesis 12, 20, and 26, and also the Levite's concubine story. And then finally, and very importantly, I wanted to entertain the question in a serious way, are women ever engaged in some kind of homosocial relationship which impacts or depends on the use of male bodies, right? And that led me to the asking, Devorah and Yael show up in the same narrative in Judges. Are these two ever friends? Do they ever have a homosocial experience? And, why is it that we don't see that on the other side? That became the sort of final chapter of the book. So I think that's how I essentially got to all of these characters. They had been already embedded in my teaching, but the experience with Christine Blasey Ford really focused my attention on the question of networks, of collusion, of bystanding, of alliance, of friendship, and of homosocial bonding.
The Blasey Ford story is an interesting, I guess, catalyst for this because it's so hard to evaluate that. I guess the last instance we had that was like that would be Clarence Thomas. Similar thing. It's a Supreme Court nominee being evaluated, but there's so many. There are partisan takes. Like there's just enough to go around, and it's really hard to get. I think if you're having a conversation, you're probably going to run into the fact that there's a partisan divide in there, but that's not the case. If we're trying, like Judah and Hira, like this story just kind of sits there, and the people who wrote that story are kind of telling on themselves because. So, do you mind walking us through that? Like, since we're setting the table, so why are they significant in this regard? What's important about their relationship?
Yeah. So. First of all, most importantly, Hira is defined and described as Judah's friend. So we already have this specific word used for Hira, and we also have, as I say in the book, a kind of king's friend character who shows up and is typically helps to, find the king a woman, female bodies, right? Acts as a counselor, right? Jonadab has essentially, he facilitates Amnon's access to his half-sister Tamar, and he too is a friend to Amnon. So you already have clearly stated in the chapter that these two are friends. You can't mistake that. You also have all these very interesting clues, right? Judah leaves his own family. He leaves his brothers. He leaves his father. He goes to Hira's locale. The Hebrew is very interesting. It describes him as turning to Hira. And within like one verse, he's found a woman in that locale and he has taken her. And then we have really, it's typical Hebrew Bible cryptic style, bang, bang, bang. Literally, he takes her, she gets pregnant, she has a son, he takes her, she gets pregnant, has a son, happens 3 times in a row. The narrative then it focuses on his sons and the way in which God gets into the act by essentially taking out the first two who do things that are in some way evil or uh, anathema to the deity. And the point at which Hera shows up again in the story is after Judah's wife has died and he has been comforted, somehow mourned enough for her. And the first thing they do is go out to celebrate. They go to a sheep shearing together. And sheep shearings and these kinds of harvest festivals are in Bible, places for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Hosea has a reason for saying, oh yeah, I know about your festivals. You're all sleeping on the threshold and, of the gates and doing illicit things. So this is what happens, right? People go, they celebrate, and when I say people, I'm thinking largely men. And these two go off, walk the road together to the sheep shearing, where it's going to be Judah's men. And both of these men, by the way, are quite powerful men in the story, because other men are not only their workers, but also have to listen to their orders. And you can see that happening too. So even though Judah is technically a foreigner, he becomes, probably with Hera's aid, a pretty wealthy dude. And as they walk out, Tamar, who is Judah's daughter-in-law, who he married first to his first son, who is effectively taken out by Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, by what you might hear as Yahweh, the Israelite deity. Judah marries her to the second son. The second son repeatedly uses her body for his sexual satisfaction. It's clear the Hebrew makes it happen not just once, but not just twice, does this repeatedly, but refuses to spill his seed in her because his inheritance would be the smaller if he actually does father a child on her. Tamar then gets sent off back to her father to a kind of living death. She's not free to marry anyone else. She's stuck there. She takes the initiative, knows that Judah's time of mourning is over, disguises herself. Judah and Hera meet her on the road. People don't think about the fact that Hera is still there. Nobody says he walks off. So what he hears and what he sees is not quite clear, but he's clearly in the neighborhood when Judah very crudely demands that Tamar have sex with him. She negotiates. They have sex. He is in a situation where he has to redeem what he's given to her, what she's asked for, all of which are really powerful identity markers. And who does he send to do that? It's Hera he sends to do that. Hera is his friend. Hera is going to do his work for him. Hera is going to find this woman and pay her off and keep this whole thing, basically managed for him. Hera doesn't find her, comes back, and Judah very interestingly says, let's forget it, lest we be a laughingstock. A fact which scholars repeatedly have just not paid much attention to, that he uses the first person plural. These two are very close. They're close enough friends that having something happen when you're powerful in your region that might get out and look a little funny is not good. We will be a laughingstock. These two have been hanging out together. They've been known as friends. By this time, it's got to be decades, really, because Judah's had 2 grown sons. And in the end, Tamar, of course, gets pregnant. Judah, as readers will probably remember, has absolutely no mercy about this and condemns her to being burned to death. And at the last minute, she says, wait, hold on. Send Judah these things, these items that are identity markers for him, and let him know, by this dude, I've gotten pregnant. And fortunately for her, one of these servant's men goes back to Judah, shows him the seal and the cord and all the stuff that she's gathered. And he says, yeah, actually, she's in the right, or depending on how you read the Hebrew, it is from me, i.e., the pregnancy. She has two sons, disappears entirely from the record, and that is the end of the story. Those two sons, of course, are ancestors of King David.
Which is why we're reading the story at all.
I think there's a likelihood that this story is meant really to be the genealogy of David, part of that genealogical record, yes. And I think this story was highly entertaining, like many of the narratives in Hebrew Bible were, and as such was probably performed, not recited or read the way that we think of things, but rather performed. In the ancient world, what's your entertainment, right? It is storytelling and story performing. So yeah, it is a very entertaining story with lots of, frankly, pretty crude sexual stuff in it and humor.
And humor. I think I just came across something on Twitter the other night where they were talking specifically about Jesus, but Jesus isn't funny. And I don't know, the more biblical studies I'm engaging with, the more funny stuff, just Hebrew Bible and New Testament, I'm finding there was
Yeah,
jokes that we don't pick up on.
that's right.
But so for her to be surreptitiously, so she's playing a trickster, and I don't know. Sorry, my dog's over here shaking his head. For tricksters, I know in the Christian traditions I grew up in, we kind of benefited from those stories, and we'd be like, this gets us to where we want to go narratively.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we really appreciate. This is essentially someone trying to execute on, and we'll use the shorthand for the Tetragrammaton. We'll say Adonai, to Adonai's covenant with Abraham. That is in the story. That's the trajectory that things are supposed to be following, right?
Mm. There are plenty of foreign women who are enlisted in the service of the Israelite Project. Tamar is just one of those women, and it is for a biblical male author whose primary concern is demonstrating that our deity, the Israelite deity, is the biggest and baddest on the block. We're not yet in a monotheistic world here. There are other deities out there, but ours is the best and the strongest and the most powerful. And we're going to show him in all sorts of ways, demonstrating his power. And these foreign women, and sometimes foreign men like Bilam, any time that you have a foreigner effectively serving the Israelite project, then it shows you how good and valuable and important that Israelite project is, right? So Tamar and Rahab, right? These are, and Ruth the Moabitess, all of whom end up becoming vessels in a way for the story of the Israelite deity and the Israelite nation, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And so that kind of leads to a type of homosociality with these male characters and the divinity.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I found it kind of interesting to have to go back to Malignant Fraternities, because Malignant Fraternities was my first monograph, but I just turned in my third monograph to Bloomsbury. And that monograph is entirely about the Israelite deity's relationships with men in the books of Samuel, and it's called Divine Masculinity. So yes, the deity has very powerful, very important um, relationships with men, and his relationships with men are what matter in the Hebrew Bible, and that even includes all of Israel, because the phrase Am Yisrael, which is so often translated as people of Israel, is really, if you look at its usage, as David J. Klein's pointed out, it's always the men of Israel. And these men of Israel may be personified as female, particularly in prophetic texts, but not solely there, right? But it's always his relationships with men that matter. And those relationships are homosocial, and they are also, at least in the work that I'm doing right now, you can see how abusive they can be.
So with the story, starting with Saul,
Hmm.
like Saul's a masculine character, right?
He starts out looking and acting like an ideal man. He is like there's almost a kind of a beauty pageant that goes on when Saul shows up. He's the tallest, he's taller than any other Israelite, right? You almost envision him standing like on the stage with all the other Israelite men. He stands out. So he's tall and he's handsome and he's good looking, right? He's described as all of these things. The deity does like good looking men. Beauty and male beauty is important to this deity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all sorts of restrictions on who can serve him as a priest, right? If there are certain kinds of bodily defects, you are not permitted to be in certain kinds of positions of power vis-a-vis this deity. But Saul, yes, starts out in this, the first description of him is one in which he seems to be the ideal man, but almost immediately you have kind of questions about this dude because what's he doing? He's engaged in looking for a bunch of donkeys for his father. And as the narrative progresses, it is his servant who knows more about what's going on than Saul. And Saul wants to go back home as soon as possible and give up the whole thing. And the servant says, no, 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 no. Let's go ask a man of God. And Saul's going, yeah, but I don't have any money. But the servant has money. Wait, why does the servant have money? Saul doesn't. So he's represented as, on one hand, a beautiful man, but also there's a certain measure of almost burlesque about him. And given that he is the deity's choice for king, right, and the deity is not super happy about being told that the Israelites want a king, it's kind of a double-edged sword what he does with Saul. Uh, he chooses Saul, but he also abuses Saul, and he does that very, very rapidly and very quickly to show who really is supposed to be the king of Israel. It's not Saul.
But I mean, it's still a pretty frenetic representation of monarchy overall, right? Like it starts like there's demands that we want a king. Well, you don't need to be like the nations, but we want a king. Okay, I'll show you. I'll give you a king, but it's not a king that's going to undermine, ultimately, like undermine the idea of what kings like show you. No, you don't. And now we'll have this bad king, and we'll go back to life. To the status quo ante, it's just like you'll get the wrong king and then you'll get a good king, even though I was telling you don't need a king at all.
And the good king, who is supposedly David, right, is good because of his, I say in the current book and also in other places, everybody loves David. David doesn't love anybody. There is no proof that he loves anyone. There's really no evidence of that except for one character, and that is the deity. David does love the deity, and so David's first and last concerns are always with what the deity is thinking about him, and the deity knows that, right? They have a very interesting bromance of their own going on, very passionate, very intense, also somewhat abusive. All we have to do is remember what the deity threatens David with after David effectively challenges the deity's honor by having Uriah killed. Because I know this might not seem like it's a challenge to the deity's honor, but when David has Uriah killed, he also ends up having a good many of Yahweh's soldiers killed because Joab sends those soldiers along with Uriah to the front. And the defeat there is an embarrassment for the deity, right? Any military defeat of any of the Israelites is always a kind of assault on the deity's honor and the deity's glory. And he is not going to forgive David for that. And so he just punishes him over and over and repeatedly over again in almost the entire rest of the story. And David keeps hoping for reprieve and never fully gets it. They don't separate, but they don't ever get the honeymoon days they had at the beginning again. So yeah, I mean, but monarchy as such never proves to be what Christian uh, Sunday schools and sometimes Jewish ones too have claimed, which is that David is this noble, wonderful, perfect exemplar of a king. I mean, he makes a lot of major mistakes, and they involve some embarrassment not only of the deity but of him. And he's not a very nice guy. I mean, in 1 Samuel 27, he slaughters men, women, and children. Civilians die in great numbers. He's the probably the biggest killer outside of the deity in the Hebrew Bible. And he engages in all sorts of rather suspect behavior. Gets his enemies taken out in very clever ways.
And I feel like this is what you just said is a thing that a lot of people, mainly Christians, I don't know if this is happening in Jewish communities, are using as justification for their own understanding of what masculinity ought to be. And I, what I found helpful about your book is reading this and having to acknowledge, like, okay, this is a representation that it's complicated at best. It is not a simple, straightforward that, like, nope, David is the hero. He's sometimes a hero, sometimes an anti-hero, but this is not a representation of, I have a son who's about to turn 18. I don't want him thinking that this is what he should be like. And so how do I engage with these biblical texts and with people who are, I guess, adopting or appropriating these texts to also tell my son what he should be like?
So this, Jared, really brings me to a question one of my students asked me Monday night in a class I'm teaching on God's body, on God's very physical body, despite the later attempts to kill that body. That God exists in the Hebrew Bible, very carnal, very physical, and carnal and physical enough that God tramples on human beings like he will trample on, human beings trample on grapes in a wine press, right? We have these kinds of texts. God's wading up to his knees in blood in various. Jesus does this in Revelations as well, right? So we have heavy duty, painful imagery of masculinity that is toxic, that is aggressive, that is that really is not merciful at all, that is misogynistic, all sorts of things that you don't want your son to be, and I certainly would not want mine to be, right? And this student asked me in that moment, oh, Dr. Tita, so we know you're a rabbi, we know you've worked to as a spiritual leader. What do you do in those contexts about these texts? And I said that I had long since realized that cherry picking these texts or manipulating them so that I can get the best possible version of them out of the actual narrative or law or whatever else I'm reading is a way to slam the door to anyone who wants to walk into my community who has themselves been the victims, first of all, of sexual assault, sexual harassment, emotional abuse. Because readers are also not stupid, right? And they look at these texts and they see when David essentially murders men, women, and children of communities, and that looks pretty scary, and nothing you can do can write that out of the text. And if you ignore it and pretend it's not there, and if you essentially avoid the implications of these texts for teaching your son and mine that certain kinds of masculinity is authorized and divinely modeled, right? If you don't address that this is a problem in these texts, just as it is a problem in our own culture, after all, we still valorize the big, the tough, the mean, the aggressive, the warrior space of masculinity, right? We're seeing this kind of valorization taking such incredible hold of all sorts of realms that we live in. Once again, if you don't see it and recognize it in the biblical texts, then you should fully expect for your own world to continue to feature toxic masculinity. So, what I said to the student is, yeah, look, I call it out when it's there. And I ask, are we prepared to say this vision of masculinity, or even this vision of the deity, is not going to work for us? We can see these texts as representing things that are toxic, and we can learn a different lesson. Not the lesson of how to fix them, how to ameliorate them, how to cherry pick them, but they can become a lesson for what we need to work on, what we might need to eradicate, what we might need to say no to. So I'll give you another quick example just to kind of bring that home. In Deuteronomy, we have a text in which an Israelite soldier is told, if you see among a captive group of people a woman who is beautiful and attractive to you, you can take her. And then for a month, you may not effectively sexually assault her. You may not use her body. For a month, she's let to mourn her family. Her hair is shaved off of her head. That's the Hebrew is much more literal. Her garments are changed. She has to, her own garments are taken away. New garments are given her, or nails have to be pared. And then after a month, you can use her as long as you want until you're tired of her. And if you're tired of her, then you have to let her go, because you have used her. And the word there that's used there is ana. You have effectively, it's one of the words that is used in rape contexts. Now, I have seen rabbis and ministers do everything they can to say, oh, look, you're dignifying this captive woman because she becomes the actual wife of the Israelite soldier. She's not just raped and then let go. She has a status. And even if she's let go, she's not allowed to be sold into slavery. So see how progressive this is? And to all of those people, I want to say, the Boko Haram took Nigerian schoolgirls out of their schools, and they forced them into marriage. The Yazidi women were forced into forced marriage by ISIS warriors, forced into being raped repeatedly. They were often given the status of wife, but would we call that anything other than a systematized use and abuse of these women and their bodies, forcing them into marriage, forcing them to endure sexual assault, forcing them to become pregnant and bear children of their enemies? So if we would not accept that in a modern setting, why are we pretending that this text doesn't exist, or that we can somehow make it look better and feel better for us when it does in the Hebrew Bible, instead of taking that text and saying, oh my God, that was wrong then and it's wrong now?
Okay, so that is the end of part 1. Saturday, part 2 will be dropping. No tag today. If you want to hit me up for feedback, it means what it means at gmail.com. All one word, it means what it means at gmail.com. If you're listening to this on the day that it releases, Wednesday, 30 April 2025, and you want to just listen to the full thing right now and not wait until Saturday, that's fine. You can jump on over to Patreon, use the link that's in the show notes, and that'll take you to Patreon, and you can become a supporter for $5 a month. I only have one tier, and I would like to get as much support over there as I can. So that said, in a few days, part 2 of Barbara Tita will be out, and we'll have a tag for next week's episode then. Take care until Saturday.